Welcome back to another endurance podcast. This is a bit of a bonus podcast. We were going to continue from our previous topics in another week or two, but since the Giro's just finished and our very own Tim was an integral part of the winning performance, before we'd slide in a little bonus one there, Tim was working with Bora planning their nutrition remotely, so unfortunately he didn't get a trip to Italy. But still, Tim, how was the experience of being involved in winning a Grand Tour for the team?
It was great. Like the first year in World Tour, and then the first win in the first Grand Tour. So I can't be more happy how everything went. And great experience. Although I didn't go to Italy, and I think, like looking back, I don't think I could add anything. And I was probably like more useful to be home, and so the people that are really like hands-on with the guys and that were actually there, because as a nutritionist, you can't really do anything that other people can't do. And we obviously have a chef. We had a chef, and he was doing an amazing job, as you could see.
So before, earlier in the season, you had been away with them for some racing, but you kind of worked out between you that working remotely was just as good, if not better, than being there.
Yeah, like it's kind of an interesting like role of a nutritionist, because some cycling teams obviously have a nutritionist on site all the time, and some don't even like work with a nutritionist. So we kind of decided to kind of the best approach of like both worlds, and try to like, because we always have a chef on the cycling race. So if we communicate well with the chef, and I communicate directly with riders and Swannies and everybody else, then perhaps I'm not needed there. And also like my time availability is not like I don't have all the time available. So it's kind of remote work works really well for me. And this way we can cover more races with full nutritional support. But I'm not like always available there. But I'm always available like on WhatsApp, and they can communicate with me, and that works pretty well.
And you get a bit of time to do all your other work as well, rather than being away from home for so long.
Exactly.
So obviously you can't really go into too much detail about the actual day-to-day plans you were doing with Bora, etc. But one of your fairly recent former colleagues, Sam Impney, was involved in a paper released recently looking at nutritional strategies during last year's Vuelta. That was for a domestique rather than sort of a team leader, but it's still some quite interesting examples of how carb intake varied for the different stages, etc. And it varied quite a lot from stage to stage, didn't it? Do you kind of follow a similar pattern with all your riders, or would a domestique differ from a team leader in any way in their nutrition?
Yeah, it's a really like tough one, because like it's 3 weeks of racing, and you never really know what's gonna happen in a stage. Even though you like a team can make a plan and you like think what's gonna happen. So for instance, like you know that you think that stage is going to be an easy one. It can be easier on the paper, but then you never know what actually happens and what other teams have in mind. And you never want them to find you on a left foot, so like without energy. And I think in the past we could clearly see that sometimes like some riders are like were feeling low and they just didn't deliver on one day, and then the next day just were flying again. And this could be down to the fueling strategies, because this balance, finding a really like balance between like maintaining weight or like gaining weight over time can be very fine. Because even if you look at the demands of the certain stages, energy expenditure can be very, very low. Some riders can be really like just basically on a recovery ride for 4 or 5 hours. And if you feed them before such a ride with loads of carbohydrates, then over time it could just be like gaining body weight. And this paper really like shows that you kind of have to fuel stage by stage rather than like the same amount every single day. And it's always about predicting what's going to happen and what the stages are going to be like. And it's pretty like it's interesting. And it's also like during the stage nutrition, it changes day to day and all those little things that like we have to think about because it's pretty easy actually to be gaining weight over time on a Grand Tour because the demands are not like such that you always need to like eat. It's kind of it's a bit of a misconception among the lay public when you just see like those mountain stages and you feel like, well, they're always doing every single day doing mountain stages, but they're not. And sometimes it's pretty easy for them. But you have to be always prepared. Like even if you're like on an easy stage, let's say there is no wind, it's a flat stage, but you get a puncture towards the end of the stage and you have to come back to the peloton. And this requires you to go full gas pretty much. So if you don't have the glycogen, you can't really do that. So it's really like, it's tricky. And in a moment you can do a mistake that costs the team, the GC, I guess.
Yeah, and a GC contender's got to be up there in every stage, and every stage is important. You know, you see quite often food crash or crosswind or something unexplained, and maybe that is nutritional at the root of it. You see a GC contender lose 5 minutes on a day and never be able to recover from that. And you could just get an unexpectedly hard day, like you say. I guess the flip side of that is if you've had, say, a big mountain stage, then you've got a rest day and a couple of flat stages after that, and then you're back into the big mountains again. You've got to balance, yes, being prepared for those eventualities of a puncture and a big chase back, but also you don't want to be gaining a kilo in those 2 flat stages before you head back into the big mountains. So it's a very, very fine balance with that. Do you, is that something you'd kind of plan a bit more for in advance, or would it be that, okay, something unexpected happened and we had a 20-minute chase to get back on, then we really ramp up the recovery process compared to what we'd expect? Or is that something that the riders, they're experienced enough to know how to fuel it during the race themselves?
So probably like cycling teams have different approaches to like the nutrition. And in that paper, like published by Sam Impey and colleagues, it was very evident that like even the nutritional strategy for the immediate post-exercise or post-ride recovery are different on day to day. And my personal view is that kind of we know that the first 4 hours are crucial in terms of like glycogen repletion. So from my point of view, it's better to like always have the same protocol, always have the same approach for after every single ride, because this is when you're not just thinking about replenishing, but you're also like kind of starting the recovery process. And also it's also like easier from the organizational perspective to then just manipulate the dinner. And from that point of view, that's probably like how I would do it. And that's also like when I'm working with athletes on a day-to-day basis, and it doesn't need to be like Bora Hansgrohe riders. It can be every other rider. There is always the same strategy for the post-exercise recovery period. So like always the same amount of carbs, always the same amount of protein. If it's an easy session, if it's a hard session, it's always the same. And then for the rest of the day, you do the manipulations as you need, and then you see how things are going. It's also like it's very easy to like communicate that with the team, and you just do a standard protocol for the recovery. So, and then for in the evening, then you actually see and evaluate how the riders are feeling, what the demands of the stage were. You get to know also like how much carbohydrates they were having during the stage, and then you can actually see how wrong your calculations or predictions were that you did the previous day, and then you kind of adjust the intake for that for the dinner. And you get probably like for the dinner also like the forecast for the next day, the weather forecast. You perhaps talk to the rider how hard the stage is expected to be, and then you kind of communicate and work out the best strategy.
Yeah, because even the sort of the during the race, the amount of carbohydrates they were taking on in that Impietal paper was quite variable, wasn't it, day to day, and even in similar sort of stages. So they split the stages up into time trials, flat stages, hilly and mountainous stages. And I think this guy was kind of a sort of a climbing domestique from what I remember. So he's obviously being expected to perform in the mountain stages as well. And his carbohydrate intake varied from like 40 grams per hour to 108 or something like that, I think, from the top of my head. So on a high mountains stage, I mean. So whether that's due to he's made a mistake on the day when he's ended up with quite a low amount of carbs, or whether that was planned, maybe. We don't know, but so you go through your main planning, I guess, is then for the dinner and during the race itself, if the rest of it is fairly standardized.
Yeah, like also one of the things that probably, like if you look at the literature, you actually see that with carbohydrate intake during like the stages or like during the cycling, the sessions, you are not really sparing a lot of muscle glycogen. So there is no evidence, for instance, that like going with 120 grams per hour versus like 90 grams per hour is actually going to spare more muscle glycogen. So pretty much, in other words, this means that by the end of the stage, basically, you always end up with the same amount of muscle glycogen. So the recovery process has to be always the same. What you actually change is basically the energy availability. If you have more, obviously, you are more like closer to what you expended. And if you are lower on intake, you have to have more energy. And basically with the carbohydrate intake during the ride, you're pretty much, in my view, manipulating how much fat you're oxidizing rather than like for the same amount of work performed. Obviously, carbohydrates are probably helping in terms of performance, going to 120, for instance, but perhaps going with like 90 and for instance, it was like just difficult to get a gel or something like that, and the rider is having less carbohydrates, and if the performance didn't suffer, then it's just fine. And probably the glycogen levels at the end of that stage would be basically the same, if that makes sense.
Right. So and is it just feedback from the rider and then like monitoring the weight that you would use to determine that? Or do they take quite an accurate measure of what they eat and drink during the stage? I mean, it's easy to forget over the course of a 6-hour race if you've had 5 gels or 7 gels or how many rice cakes, etc.
You would be surprised to how accurate they actually are. Like I get a list of what they have exactly. And it makes sense, and those numbers are very valuable, so that you can actually see whether like you were having not enough and try to improve that, or like you get the feedback in terms of like, I was feeling thirsty, what can we do about that? And then you could try to like give them advice on what can be improved in that regard, and which can be really helpful. But yeah, some riders are really good on its own, and you just don't need to tell them because they're like so experienced. In the end of the day, nutrition is not like, it's not like following exact rules, and also like the tactics change, and the same is like nutrition. They can actually do their own job very in a good way. But I'm always there, like if they need my help, they can ask for advice. And yeah, some riders like want more input from you, and some riders just don't need any input whatsoever. So it's really like individual, I guess.
Yeah, by the time they've got to that level, they've got a really good understanding of what works for themselves.
Also, like, yeah, if I can add, for instance, like even doing the calculations, we are very, very like the calculations we do for like energy expenditure are very crude. So when you like, even though we like all the riders are having a power meter, and if you like take a look at how then the energy expenditure is calculated, basically what you do is you assume a certain percent of efficiency. So for instance, like 24% or 25%, that's what usually is taken in the calculations by Garmin and Strava. And then you get the value in kilocalories, and it's usually like it coincidentally works out as amount of kilojoules can be directly converted to kilocalories, and that's what you get a number. And this is basically pretty much a number, because even if you like look at what happens in the laboratory when you actually accurately measure energy expenditure, you can actually see that the efficiency is nowhere near 24% all the time, or can vary like from 18% to like 25. So those are predictions that you make are predictions in the first place. So and the efficiency can be lower, and you can actually be under fueling the riders just because you've made the wrong assumptions. So be very strict with this, like calculating when the food can actually like backfire in you, and you can make a mistake very quickly. So it's always like listening to the riders and how they feel, seeing their day-to-day like performance, their day-to-day feelings, and also like measuring variables like body weight can actually be very helpful in my view. But obviously you don't want to like obsess too much with the numbers, because it can be psychologically, I think, pretty hard. If, for instance, somebody is hungry and they say, no, you can't eat more.
It's detrimental.
Yeah.
And even those energy efficiency calculations, even in the lab, are based on relatively low intensities, aren't they? It's not applicable once they're going full gas. So there's always going to be quite a bit of an inaccuracy there. So having that very simple backup of just weighing the morning after gives you probably a better idea of if something's majorly gone wrong anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But also like it's hydration, it also has an influence. You never really know. You're like always guessing. And I think this is like how you basically, it's down to you, how you kind of understand physiology and like everything in general, so that you kind of figure out what it was. And it's also down to experience on how you predict what's going to happen the next day, what the demands are. And it can be really tricky, but with like a kind of, the work, the more you work with athletes, the better you become in this. And it's not just numbers, it's also like the feelings and how they feel. And
yeah, being hungry isn't good for morale, is it?
No.
So it was a really close Giro this year, and we've seen up until that final mountain stage anyway, and we've seen a lot of that over the last few years, that the favourites are really close to each other right up until the final days. So we were talking about how the fatigue resistance plays quite a big role in a race, both as part of a one-day race. Generally, the person who gets to the end with able to put out more power in a fatigue state is going to more likely be the winner, but also over the course of a Grand Tour, it makes such a huge difference, doesn't it? I saw an interesting anecdote about Chris Froome the other day coming 11th in a one-day race, and that was actually equaled his highest one-day racing placing since he'd become a Grand Tour rider really and started riding for Team Sky. And I guess that both shows that he's targeted stage races more, but maybe also shows that part of what made him one of the best riders for so long was the fact that over the course of a Grand Tour, he had brilliant fatigue resistance, not over just one day, but over the course of 3 weeks. So we normally think of fatigue resistance as kind of, yes, I can maintain a high power output after doing so many kilojoules or so many TSS during a race, but over the course of a Grand Tour, that's a huge thing. And I think probably nutrition plays a bit of a role in that as well, would you say?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's you see the riders and you see like how the performance changes, and when you feel like, I often because I ride a lot, and I really like to ride in Italy and on all those climbs, and every year they come to like those mountains, I just go on Strava and compare the results. But the funny thing is, they're doing those climbs after like 2 or 3 weeks or like hard racing, and you do those climbs in a fresh state, and it's a big difference. So for instance, like when I do usually like I try to experiment everything on my own, and like last year we did like 2 weeks in Livigno in Italy, and like doing the Stelvio and all those climbs, and you actually feel it like after 2 or 3 weeks, even like 1 week or and a week and a half, how tired your legs become and how less explosive like you become, and it's also like you're just basically trying to do that sweet spot, and just hang on, and it's really hard work, and nutrition definitely plays a really important role here, and I think it actually be crucial and detrimental if you like even 1 day of underfueling can actually get you deep into a hole that you do not recover for like a few days actually. So it's nutrition is very, very important, but looking at like the Giro and the last stage, I don't think like the nutrition was the decisive like part, because I'm pretty sure that all like the nutritionists from other teams also did their jobs incredibly well in terms of like getting the enough carbs at the start of the stage. It was then towards the end how much it was left, and it was then probably down to relative effort. I don't know. And basically, after 2 or 3 weeks of racing, where that fatigue resistance is for both like Carapaz and then Jai Hindley. I don't know how you see it as a coach.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the fact that Carapaz was in the jersey for so long and probably had slightly different responsibilities after the stage, and there's all those little minor additions that just all accumulate. So that's just a little bit more fatigue over the course of 3 weeks as well. You know, I know Team Sky Ineos sort of led the way really in trying to minimise those, I guess, because they spent so much time in the jerseys of Grand Tours, you know, helicoptering people off mountains and stuff like that to try and get them back to the hotel and recovering as quickly as possible. Those pressures as of a race leader and just the general fatigue over the course of 3 weeks of pressure of interviews and everything obviously plays a role as well. But we've seen in so many, I think the level of the race leaders in these Grand Tours is so high at the moment that we've seen a lot of really close racing. So it is these marginal gains that make the difference. I thought that it would have been interesting to see how Almeida fared if he hadn't had to retire through COVID, because he was he was either just slightly off the pace, you could argue, of the top two, or he was conserving his energy very well on every stage, because he'd seemed to get dropped quite early on a mountain, but then come the finish line, he'd only be 10 seconds behind. So I think he sort of had a bit of a collapse the day before he retired, but he was probably already had a bit of COVID in him by that point. Whereas up until then, he was only, I think, 40 odd seconds behind Carapaz, and so maybe it's all speculation, but if he'd carried on that same pattern, he could have actually been one of Hindley's closest rivals in the end, if he was only that 40 odd seconds behind going into the final time trial. So yeah, I think that would have been a really interesting battle potentially for the podium, or maybe even the win, if he'd been able to carry on that same strategy, and whether he was using his experience of leading the Giro for so long a couple of years ago, when he spent sort of a couple of weeks in the pink jersey and then blew up a little bit and just thought, right, I'm really conserving my energy day by day, because it's those final few days that make a big difference. That could have been potentially a really, really interesting finish to the Giro. But yeah, everyone's very on it with the nutrition and their cool down strategies, etc. now following these races. So yeah, the margins of winning and losing are really tiny.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's part of the sport, because if you think about it, we can go to the lab and measure their critical power. We can measure their W prime. We can measure critical power in fatigued state, after 2000 kilojoules of work. And then we could just make a list and decide who's the winner of the Grand Tour based on the physiological data. That would be super cool from my perspective, but that's definitely not sport.
Watch, I think.
Yeah, and things can happen, we had in our team, Wilco Kelderman, problem with the wheel and the spokes, and basically it happens. So that's why sport is so interesting, and even looking forward to the Tour de France, we all say yeah, it's gonna be Pogacar winning, but one single stage when something unexpectedly can happen to his bike, and suddenly everyone else can win the Tour, for instance, and you never know what's going to happen, and this is part of the sport, and that's why it's exciting. So we have all those ifs, and this is basically in the end, it's the person that makes the least mistakes actually wins, and that's how it is, and that's part of basically that's fun.
And it would almost be the dream scenario that Pogacar has a mechanical problem in the first week, loses 5 minutes, but he's obviously still healthy, still on form, and he has to spend the next 2.5 weeks chipping away at that 5 minutes, because it would change the tactics of the race completely, and it would, he'd have to try and completely blow the race apart to make up those 5 minutes, or somewhere down the line one of his rivals has a similar problem. That's part of what makes it so interesting and so hard to plan for. So you can only plan so much, can't you? The road decides at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it was a similar story like Chris Froome in 2018 on Giro, because he was well, he's not gonna win it. He's just there, but in the end he won it, and it was incredible and spectacular to actually watch that. And it's still we are 2022 and we are still talking about that win of Chris Froome from 2018 because it was so spectacular, and those comebacks are always kind of fun, and looking at this Giro this year, it could be seen as a boring one, because basically nothing really big happened until the penultimate day. And even on that day, it was probably not a big attack from Jai. It was basically that Karapats couldn't sustain the pace anymore.
Yeah.
And this is how it was decided. So at the end, it was the best one, the best man that won the race, undoubtedly. And that's how it is. And every single the Grand Tour is interesting on its own for certain reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great race to watch, and it was good to get a few insider tips from you as the race went on. Sort of on a personal level, is there anything you'd say you've learned from, well, I guess your season so far as your first season working in the World Tour and the Giro as your first Grand Tour, that you would, carry on to either working with the team going forward into the Tour de France, or even on your own, on a personal level with your riding that you'd say?
Yeah, there are always things that you learn, and it's always how to work in these stressful situations. So for instance, if you see low morning body weight, and you feel well, could it be glycogen? Could this be the day when you basically lose the GC because the previous day the nutrition was not right, and how to prevent this in the future? Or for instance, it's a hot day stage, and you haven't really the protocol, or what you had in mind wasn't the best scenario or the best idea. And there are always things that you can learn and improve. And I think that's part of the game from all aspects. It's not just me that can improve, but it's always other parts of the team as well, and how to get better and better. And this is why we are seeing better and better performances every single year. And I think one of the things that is improving over the time is basically fatigue resistance, because those little things are not probably so little. Getting everything.
The 3 weeks into the difference essentially between first and second place, as we saw on that penultimate stage.
Exactly. Even if look and read the books by I don't know, is it Chris Froome or anyone else, we can probably see Chris Froome and then Lance Armstrong and those older guys. Nutrition was important, but when we now start talking about fructose and the amount of protein and this source of this and that, it becomes clear why those guys without doping can actually achieve the same results. And because mountain stages always come in the second and third week. It's not that we are basically comparing the times in a fresh state. And because I'm sure that in a fresh state, those doped guys would be just flying and still be much faster, but we are actually talking in the third week. And those results are now comparable with doping or without. And I think it's basically down to the recovery strategies that are getting much better than they were in the past. So they're catching up with what doping was able to actually do. And now it's basically the type of carbohydrates. It's, I don't know, thinking about electrolytes. It's thinking about, I don't know, massage. It's thinking about all those things that can in the end add up and make a difference.
Yeah. Put the EPO budget into the rider support budget instead, and it's transferred into the same results with a bit better ethics.
Yeah, because I personally I know I'm now part of a cycling team, but even if you ask me a year ago, I would probably say that those riders are pretty much clean. It's actually those that the best of the best are pretty much clean. I really don't think that you need to take anything in terms to achieve the performance that those guys are achieving. And they're just doing everything right as best as they could.
Cool. Well, it was great to have a relatively short chat for this one. Next time we'll return back to our previous topic. So we talked before about higher and lower level pro races. We'll say we'll talk about nutrition and training for more amateur stage races, and then go on to how you can use those tips for doing a training camp, which might be the closest most people get to doing a Grand Tour. So we'll catch up on that in a couple of weeks. If you got any questions in the meantime, great to hear some comments. So let us know, and we'll be back in touch soon.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Very much.